In this lesson, we'll start to set up some different render layers so we can begin outputting our scenes in things like a depth pass, a color pass, and an occlusion pass. Okay, so at this point we're now pretty much wrapped up with the material application and the basic light setup. So now let's start the process of bringing in some different material presets for our render layers. So the first thing we need to do is set up our first render layer. So let's go over to Render. Okay, so that will open up the render layers. Now the first thing we need to do is take all of our objects and assign them to a render layer. So I would highly recommend doing this through the outliner, so that way if you have any groups, you can make sure that you get any groups and individual objects that you want. Once you have those selected, we can go over here to this Make New Render Layer with selected objects. There we go, so there's layer 1. And we can call this anything that we want, something like Occlusion Pass. There we go. Now, in previous versions of Maya, we had the ability to actually just use a material preset. Now, in Maya 2009, that ability has been removed. So now, if we want to use any presets like the occlusion, we actually have to come in and now build those from scratch. So, really, that's not a problem. All we have to do is start with a basic surface shader for the occlusion. So this will be the material that the occlusion is actually plugged into. Let's go over to the metal ray nodes. We'll go down to Textures and drop in the MIB Ambient Occlusion. We'll just middle click, connect this over to Default, and there we go. This has now been connected up to the surface shader. So let's take a look inside the ambient occlusion. Just one thing that we need to adjust is the max distance. We want to make sure that this is set to a value other than 0. Otherwise the sampling rays will just reach out to infinity and really start to slow our renders down. So let's start by just giving it some kind of a value. This is a pretty good value to start with as far as getting kind of a nice, soft, kind of spread out ambient occlusion effect. And again, the values that you wind up putting in here are entirely dependent on your scene size. So let's go ahead and select all the objects. Take our surface shader right here, right click, and go to Assign Material to Selection. Let's not necessarily assign it as an override because, as we'll see here in just a moment, we'll actually need a couple of different materials. So assign material to selection, and you'll see that the occlusion pass now inherits that material. However, if I go back to the master layer, you'll see that all the original materials still remain intact. So the material that we just assigned is only applicable on this one particular layer. So let's just see what we have once we render this out. And you'll see that once the render is complete, that we do have this really nice ambient occlusion effect, which is really good for giving us these nice soft shadows. And this will be perfect for compositing on top of our color pass. Now, the one thing that you will notice right now is the fact that we do still have this blue environment. So we can actually override this on a per render layer basis. So all we have to do is, with this occlusion pass selected, let's go to View, select Camera. Take a look inside the attributes for this. We'll scroll down and look for the environment color. Now what we can actually do is create something called a layer override, which basically is a setting for an attribute that only applies when a particular render layer is active. So a good illustration of this would be something like this background color. If I right click on the actual attribute and create a layer override, you'll see it turns orange, which indicates that a layer override is now in place. So with this layer override in place, now I can switch the background to something like white. And this background color of white will only be applicable on this occlusion pass. So now when I render, you can see that we now get this nice white background, which is exactly what we want. Now one of the things you will notice now is that once we render, we actually do not have any sort of displacement effects that are on this squid. So we don't get the occlusion effect of things like the tentacles of the squid as far as having the suckers and things like that. So what we want to do is now make a duplicate of this surface shader that will have the displacement effect. So all we would really need to do is duplicate this surface shader, take our ambient occlusion, plug it into default, so that way we have this single ambient occlusion node that drives both of these shaders. And on one of these, this duplicate one, we can just take our displace that we've already applied to the skin, just simply middle click, drop it onto the displace, And you'll notice that once I try to connect this, that there is actually no displacement attribute to be found. So rather than just simply duplicating this surface shader, we will want to make sure that we actually create a new one from scratch. So let's just go back over here, make a new surface shader from scratch. There we go. And now middle click and connect to displacement map. And the reason that the displacement option doesn't show up in this duplicate whenever we originally duplicated it from this one is because the displacement has to be connected to a shading group. And whenever we just do a standard duplication of any of these shaders, it does not duplicate the shading group with it. So now that we have this duplicate version, just middle click and connect it to the actual squid body. There we go, and let's re-render this. Alright, excellent. And now you can see that we get the occlusion effect that's been applied to this squid. And now we can start to see the actual displacement that comes with that. Alright, so now that we have the occlusion pass set up, let's do the same thing for the depth pass. So that way we can start to do some depth of field in post. So let's just simply take our existing pass, our occlusion. Let's right click, select all the objects in the layer. So that way it's just a little easier way as opposed to having to go back to the outliner to do it. With this selected, let's just simply make a new layer. And we'll call this something like depth pass. There we are. Now again, in previous versions of Maya, we actually used to have a preset that we could rely on to create our luminance depth. Now that ability does not exist now in Maya 2009. So what I've actually done is just simply exported the old material preset from an older version of Maya. And now rather than having to build the shading network, we can just import it back in. So let's now import. And if you take a look inside the ZBrush character project, I've actually included this shader in the project, so you can actually just simply import this into your scene as well. This is the luminance depth preset. And again, this comes from an older version of Maya. So just simply import this in, and there we go. So just like all the occlusion preset that we did just a moment ago, just select all your objects, right-click, and assign material to selection. There we go. Let's take a look at the input and output connections for this. Now, a couple of things that we will need to do is to actually change inside this set range. We'll need to set the old minimum and old maximum to the appropriate value, so that way we can start to get the depth in here. Now, as far as measuring that depth, a quick and easy way that I find to be able to do this is to just simply drop in a basic locator. And once we drop that in, we can now go to Display, Heads-Up Display, and turn on the Object Details. Now that'll tell us whatever object we have selected, in this case Locator 1, we can see that object's distance from the camera. We can use this value as an appropriate value to plug in to the set range. So if we were to bring this locator roughly up to the front part of the squid, we can see that the distance from camera is about 17.8. We'll go ahead and just round that up to 18. And once we pull this back, we can see that we're at 29.5. And we'll go ahead and just round this up to 30 just to be on the safe side, or just to make easy numbers to remember. So now let's take this set range, and let's just break the connection to what we have here already. There we go. And we'll set the old minimum, again, to about 17. And the old maximum to about 30. There we go. Excellent. So let's take a look at what we have now. And now you can see that we do now have a little bit of depth in here, although you can see we are back to having this blue background again, which, as I mentioned, these layer overrides that we applied on the occlusion pass only are applicable when this pass is active. So rather than going back and enabling the environment again, let's take this background sphere, let's take a look at its render stats, and for this particular pass, we'll activate its primary visibility. And you'll see whenever we enable this that it automatically creates a layer override for me. And again, you can see because it turns this attribute orange. And now this gives us a nice black and white depth pass. So these objects that are closest to the camera are shaded bright white. And you'll see that as we start to get further and further away from the camera, that we start to transition more and more into the black color. So this can be used as a way of adding the depth of field effects in a post environment. Now again, just like with the occlusion, you'll see that the actual depth pass does not have any sort of displacement effect in it. So just like what we did with the occlusion pass, let's come in and just start by creating a new surface shader. There we go. And on this luminance depth, we'll go ahead and connect this to the default. And in order to connect this properly, we need to take the out value of this preset, or this luminance depth, take the out value X, and plug that into out color R, G, and B. And now we have an exact duplicate of this original luminance depth shader, except now we have this one that, just like with the occlusion pass, we can take our displacement, middle click, connect it to displacement map, and now we can take our squid body, assign that to the selection, and now what we should get is the effect of the displacement map on this particular squid body. And you can see that that is taking effect now because you can actually now see the silhouette of these suckers. Okay, so now really the last thing we have to do is now just set up our color pass. So we could have either done this before we set up the depth and occlusion passes, or we can go ahead and just do it at this point. So just like before, let's right click on any of these passes, select the objects in the layer, make a new pass. And this one, you can see it will just simply inherit all of the original settings that we had set up on the master layer. So this one, we can just call something like color pass. Alright, so now in order to render this out, let's go over to the render settings. We'll take a look inside the common tab, so that way we can define the output for this. So we probably want to get this something that has an alpha channel in it, so a target creates a good combination between having a nice high quality file and a low file size. We can also start to give this a name prefix, so we can call this something like squid. And if we were to simply render this out right now, you can see it would render out to this particular directory that I have set up in my project, but it would make a new folder for the color pass. And inside that, there would be a folder called squid.tga. This would do the same for depth pass, occlusion pass, and so on. Now in my case, I actually don't want this to create a new folder. I want all of the images to be contained in one. So a really easy way to do this is to give this a layer label. So all we have to do is right-click on the file name prefix, and we can insert any of these labels, things like a layer name, camera name, pass name, so on and so forth. In this case, we want to name these according to the render layer name. So render layer, and now you can see that we'll get a file output called squid_color_pass. If I select the depth, you can see now it's going to render out squid_depth. So it'll put all of these in one directory with the appropriate suffix at the end. So now, once we have this set up, we have all of the other things set up as far as the indirect lighting. The actual quality of the render is set to an appropriate level. So now all we have to do is go over to the rendering menu, go up to render, and batch render. And once the render process is complete, you'll have your different render passes, or rather your different render layers, now available to you to use for any kind of compositing application, whether that be Shake, whether it be Fusion, Photoshop, After Effects, whatever the case may be. So what we're going to do in our next lesson is use Photoshop and take all of these different render layers that we've now set up and now bring them together into one final composited image.